Okay, so make yourself comfortable and our usual posture. Feet down, weight a little bit forwards, put most of your weight back in hips and buttocks, supported by the chair. Just slightly angled forwards to get that little bit of weight in your feet. But you're back with this very long feeling and a sense that what is keeping your head up is this feeling of support coming up through your feet, through your hips, lower back, hips, buttocks, and legs to an extent. They have this slightly denser feel. So almost as though you're in water, and just the very act of sinking down creates that sort of push up. Or alternatively, if you were going to sit in a very springy chair, we kind of drop down and then feel the push up. So we feel that support, upward support in the body through the sinking down. And in addition, imagine from your hips to your shoulders, the tail of your spine to the crown of your head, little sort of like pulley cords. And so as your pelvis drops back and as your hips drop back into the chair, those pulley cords sort of draw your head and your shoulders upright. This is a very interesting process when we get it right, because we begin to feel as though we're not having to put any effort at all into holding ourselves up. We lose a lot of that stiffness and tightness around the body. But then when you put your feet out, you could stay upright, but it seems to require a lot more effort because your pelvis is trying to tilt back. And so we naturally go back in the chair. And it's a good indication really of the interconnected quality of the body, that as soon as you do something with your feet, the shoulders are affected. So let yourself drop back. Feel your weight sinking into the chair. It's a nice, slow, deep breath. Focus on that feeling of dropping back and the effect that has on ribs, shoulders, belly. So now, bringing your feet in, and again, you could stay back, but that can feel a bit difficult. It depends partly on your chair, of course, but relatively easy just to let your pelvis roll forwards. So you go forwards, and then imagine somebody just pulling on your belt from behind the chair and drawing you back in, and you get back to that position that we had a few moments ago, about 2/3 of your weight in your feet. And then just slowly turning your head. So this posture, and perhaps more significantly, the sort of quality, the feeling we get from this posture is maintained all the way through the different exercises. Obviously, the angle of the upper body will change at times, but that sense of being supported in the upper body, of your head and your shoulders connected to what's happening in your hips, and that sense of space that comes from the release of tightness and stiffness as your center of gravity drops. You want to try and maintain the whole time, which is quite tricky at times. And then your shoulders. Going forwards. And then hands down to your sides. Raise up a little bit, wind around. And then back the other way. Rest your hands. Easing forwards and push it back. This time turn a little bit. So you go towards one knee. Remember the turn is in your hips. And then in the other direction. And circling around. Remember that idea of opposite movement. So as your hips go to the left, the shoulders and your head go to the right. As your hips go down, your head and your shoulders come up. As your hips go to the right, head and shoulders move out to the left, and so on. Providing a counterbalance to the movements. So to change direction, focus on your hips, the lower part of your back, move there, and look for that feeling of your head and shoulders, your upper body following the movement. Note that there'll also be some kind of movement in your arms as well. Come back to the center. Just raise one foot, and the opposite movement is the other leg pushing down. So you push down, sort of push the heel up, step out, and push down to bring the foot in. And then on the other side. The hands to your sides. Oh, I know what we didn't do. Just rubbing your hands together. I meant to do this at the beginning, but we'll do it now. Tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. On the shoulder. Arm. The side. Upper part of your chest. Belly. And then your legs. Right. So hands at your side once again. Third opposite swing, rocking forwards, feeling the chest and upper back open and close, and then back. So I'm changing to fisherman castanet. So each time you come up, you're going to gain that sense of how your head, the shoulders are being supported, how they're moving from the impetus, the center of the body and the movement of your weight. And the pelvis angling slightly, tilting slightly. And then your feet pushing back, hips dropping back into the chair. regular rhythmic flow to the movement. And then as though there's a ball behind your arm, between your arms and your chest, coming over. You start to imagine the ball getting a little bit heavier gradually. The way that you're doing this will strengthen up, the connections will be more obvious to you. An image of the ball maybe going from a big plastic one there inside it to maybe something a little bit more solid and maybe made of wood or something. So, whatever image suits you best. Now, pigeon spread to springs, turning your hands in, still a little bit forwards, probably not so much as the last one. One more time. And then pushing a wave. One more time. Hands come down to a point just above the level of your hips, loosely fisted. Arms extending out and drawing back a little, but not so much that your elbows go right back. Elbows stay slightly in front of your hips, or at least in line with your hips. But still, of course, the movement of your weight, your arms rotating. One more. And then the sequence of 3. Pigeon spreads its wings, pushing a wave, and punch with both fists. One more round of this. So I'm turning your hands further out, coming back, winding your arms around, pressing. Once more. Your hands around, turning them palm down. Then remember hips moving towards the right, so the hands going to the left and then forwards and around, polishing the table. So see if you can feel that little movement in the tail of your spine or your hip, the back of the pelvis, whichever way you think of it. And try and make that your primary focus. Notice how shoulders, head, arms and hands are moved by that movement. Now, if you can feel that seated, that's great, because when you come to standing, it will be very clear, hopefully. There is always a counterbalancing movement, an opposite movement. More than one, quite often. So another example of an opposite movement here might be, as your hands go forward, feels as though again your sternum's going back, and then comes forwards again. I'm exaggerating now, but see how the sternum, the solar plexus really drop back. One more on each side. Bring your hands and palm up, pressing gently down with your feet and your hips, feeling your back lengthen and contract. Do one more. And then change into the wild goose. And then parting the clouds, easing forwards, letting your hands go slightly in front of your knees. Sitting back, and again that push down through your feet and your hips. And dragon plucks the stars from the sky. Ultimately, all of those opposite movements will find their way down into the ground. Not always directly, but here and with the previous movements, it is a straight push down through feet and hips, but here alternating from side to side. Try not to let that push down push you over on this occasion. Sometimes we do that, of course. But rather keep your weight in the middle as much as you can so that all the sort of energy of the push goes straight up. One more time. Good. Your hands around, same push down. So I said earlier about sinking into the chair and feeling the push up, and that's the same thing, the downward movement, downward energy, producing an upward energy. In the case of when we're letting the hips sink, is the yielding to the pull of gravity. But we just slowly build on that, still feeling that fall down, but almost like you're preparing to stand up. Just sort of like putting that little bit of pressure downwards. And the energy that comes from that moving up through the pattern, your upper body and your arms. Adding the turning. So that downward and upward movement represent two of the most fundamental sort of energies. Downward energy, so to review, the upward energy is Pung. And with this exercise, we see how we establish that pattern, but then for the turn-in, there's a kind of spiraling, a rotation around the center part of the body. Like when water in a water mill turns the wheel. Similar sort of idea. And that's because we become very aware, and a lot of our intent is placed in that area. Obviously, for that to work well, you have to have an idea of what the pattern is. So, one more time. But we get better at that, and we get better at identifying how the center dictates the pattern. And so we get to a point where even with movements that we're not sure of, new movements, we can begin to feel the connection. And then I'll put out, scooping the sea and looking at the sky. So our intent is increasingly focused through that area of the lower Dan Chen, between hips and navel. It's not that we're not we don't have intent in our arms, or we're not aware of what our legs are doing. But it's like this is, I suppose, a bit like a telephone exchange. You know, when, I don't know if it still works like that. Actually, it used to work. I think you have telephone exchanges, and your message would get taken into the telephone exchange, and from there it would go out to whoever was receiving it. It's probably changed now, so it may not be a great example. So now, change into grasping the tiger's ears. And then on the other side. Good, and change. That area, of course, is also the area that we're looking at the breathing and this deeper breathing pattern. That's the area that we breathe into initially, or rather, that's the area that we feel expanding, beginning the expansion that draws the air down into our lungs. Some years ago, I read in a translation of a Chinese text that there have been reports that some practitioners of this art had recorded changes in the nerve ganglia where the nerves clustered together in the area of the lower Danshen. I sort of dismissed it because particularly at that time, I think it was very easy for claims to be made and not be substantiated, and it seemed a bit unlikely. But subsequently came across this theory, this notion, reality really, of neuroplasticity and how sort of like certain actions and things like that, certain processes can change the map of the brain and the nervous system. And suddenly it didn't seem so unlikely that actually, you know, it's a suggestion that actually we get better at doing something, which of course we know that we do. If you practice something, if you practice typing on a keyboard or playing a musical instrument, you become more familiar with it, and this involves changes in the nervous system. So if you practice focusing into the center of the body, then and practice focusing on those opposite movements, you'll begin to recognize them in lots of different areas. But more importantly, your body will start to use them more. And of course, that becomes very significant when we come to the standing. So let's go to standing now. Rubbing your hands together. And once again, tapping over your face. Over the top of your head. Down to one shoulder. Your arm. Then on the other side. Part of your chest. Belly. And then finally your legs. Okay, now stand. So I'm going to get a little bit technical with you for a few moments. So look again at the significance of that awareness of what's happening in the center of the body and those opposite movements. But to begin with, just sort of go back to this rocking your weight forwards and backwards that we've done in the chair, but also we've done many times standing. So we do actually lean slightly when this happens. But we soon discover that if we lean too much, then we lose the ability to remain upright. Our center of gravity goes out too far. And that can be useful sometimes, the center of gravity moving out. But we want to retain some kind of control over it, because if it just goes out there, that's when we fall. And it's those opposite movements that enable us to do that. So now when we here, if you look at the stick there, it's more or less going from the crown of my head down into that point just behind the balls of my feet. And when I go forwards, I move away from that a little bit, but not too much. And then I go back. If I go too far again, that's going to happen. So this is what we do in that exercise. We use this movement to help us find this midline. But assuming that you found that, the next stage is quite interesting, because we do this, and if say you were walking along, you might want your center of gravity to go slightly forwards, but not pull you over. So when I get to here, now my hips go back, and this is the tilting movement. I'm exaggerating this. So I get a certain amount of impetus going forward, but here my center of gravity is still going straight down through my legs. And then I can just go forward a little bit more, and that can help me take the step. But I have a great deal more control. So when we do things like polishing the table, this is the movement that we do. In the same way, you know, if you had your washing up to do or something like that, you wouldn't want to do this because you'll end up falling into the washing up. But you can do this. So that awareness of those opposite movements goes a long way towards helping our stability. And leave this with some kind of choice, really. You know, we don't want to be pulled along simply by the pull of gravity. It's like, you know, you start to run downhill and you can't stop because you're constantly out there. And yet at the same time, a little bit of that in normal walking, not in the Tai Chi walking that we do, but I'm here, I want to get over there. I don't stay like this, I kind of angle slightly. So there's a certain amount of pull forwards, but I'm aware of the pull back as well. So I can keep a kind of sense of balance there. So you know, what may sound like something deeply kind of like theoretical actually has a very practical element to it. So let your weight settle in the middle, sinking down and pushing up. And then wild goose. And roundabout. Good. Shake out. We'll do the exercise polishing the table. As always, be careful with this. And if you want to use a chair for support, then just do it with one hand, that's fine. Because it's not really the hands that are important. When I turn around, to make sure you can still see me, you imagine somebody takes hold of your belt or something like that. So I will face the front in a few moments, but just imagine somebody takes hold of you and pulls you in one direction and then another. So when say that area of the back, lower part of your spine goes to your left, the front of your body turns to the right, and then the opposite way round. And then you turn in one direction, and then this area gets pulled back. So this tilts the body, and then across. And then it's like they push on the tail of your spine, and you come back to the upright. And then you go in the other direction. and up. So remember, this is the tilting, not the leaning. It's your hips going back that stop you falling forward. If you feel as though when your shoulders go forward, you're sort of tumbling over, you're doing it wrong. You need to focus on this movement going back. It's exaggerated, by the way. So you don't necessarily have to go that far here. Doing that, you keep your hands in front of you. Turn. And slowly, if you imagine that your hands are actually resting on a table, as your shoulders go forward, it will push your hands forward. So you do very little with your hands. So polishing the table. All of these movements, when we do the exercises, are somewhat exaggerated. At least when we're standing. So don't always do this big. Sometimes do it quite small, so you could hardly see that movement going in the back. So that, as with a lot of movements, they become very internalized. Good. Polishing the table. Now, have 1 foot forwards, transferring your weight. While we do this, while remaining upright, with the pole. So at the moment, you can see as I move, that center line moves with me. And when I begin to raise my toes and my heel, I keep my relationship with it. I'm not doing this. When my heel, I'm not doing this. So I stumbled there. I'm just gradually moving back more so it becomes more aligned over the foot. And then when I start to step in, just bring the foot in. So again, what I don't want to do is get to here and then do this because I stumble forwards. You get the idea. I'm just using the pole as a visual representation. Obviously, that completely straight line is imaginary. There isn't a, it's not like your spine is that straight or anything like that. Nobody's is. It's not meant to be. So it's this imaginary grid line going through your body. And then on the other side. Starting to raise your toes and your heel. One of the things you'll find as you take this on board is that you're letting go in your hips more to avoid that sort of leaning out. And so it gets much stronger in your legs. You wanted to hear that, didn't you? Stepping in. And then taking a few steps forwards or backwards. and then change direction. And in a few moments, we're going to do scooping the sea and looking at the sky standing. Now, let me just show you how that works with this idea of the visible center line and the opposite movements. So if I simply to lean forwards, then the whole body will go forwards, and yet that can be quite useful because that can take my weight into the front leg. So if we get in the pole, what actually happens is, I need to move my hand there. My hips go back. So there's that counterbalancing movement. But I just allow my center of gravity to go forward a little bit, and that just pulls me forwards there. I'm ready to counterbalance the movement, but the problem there is I could still end up taking a nosedive. So as I go into the front leg here, I feel the weight in the front leg. Sorry, I should say this goes here. I now let my hips drop down, and that brings me to the upright position, and then I can go back a little bit because we come over. So there's the counter movement here, and here, and then here. I have a sense that some of that is actually going on while we're doing ordinary walking. Remember, I said that movements get quite small. It's almost like, it's almost John Cleese, isn't it? We could do the funny walk. We go forwards and then come up, and we do it big. We can see how this movement here also helps to move the leg. It's this, and then suddenly we're stable on this leg. Now, obviously, you don't see that when you're walking along, but you can begin to feel that kind of movement. So you can get the advantage of having your center of gravity slightly forwards, giving you that momentum without it actually taking over. So again, very carefully, then use the chair for support. Have 1 foot forwards and slightly turned out. Do it a little bit from the side. Hands at your sides. Hips, buttocks, lower back going back, but a sense of being drawn forwards, and then just letting the hips drop down again, and you come back. Scooping the sea and looking at the sky. This pivoting movement with the opposite movements through the tail of your spine and hips and so on. Pivoting on the hips. So this becomes a bit of a link between the sort of Tai Chi walking, remaining upright, and just our everyday walking, where there is that bit of angling of the body. One more. And then have your other foot forwards, slightly turned out again, scooping the sea and looking at the sky. It has a profound effect on your upper body because the heavy lifting, if you like, is being done through your legs and your hips. So one of the offshoots of this, of course, is that we get a much stronger sense of flowing and energy through the upper body. Less stiffening, less stiffening up, and tightening up. One more time. And bring your feet down. Good. So go back to your chair. So yes, as I said, that's a bit technical, but sometimes it's useful to think in those terms in Tai Chi, and quite often to begin with, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It sort of feels a bit awkward, and that's partly because, as I said, we do tend to exaggerate the movements. We have to, really. I think those kind of little changes that we become aware of in hips, pelvis, pelvic floor, as we just go through our practice, are reflected in our daily lives, but they're hidden, and not only are they hidden, but they're often easily lost. So it's worth practicing them. And I think the chair-based exercise is actually very interesting for doing that, because if I do scooping the sea here, it's not so obvious that I need to get my hips, I need to have a feeling in my hips, lower back, of going backwards here, because it's there. But if I just simply lean forward, I sort of I kind of flop forward. If I push my hips back, I have more control as I go back. But it's very, very subtle. It's a lot more subtle in the chair than it is standing. And since awareness is such a key part of these things, and we're bringing these processes into awareness where we can apply our intent, that amplifies them, that helps them to build. So arguably the knock-on effect into our daily lives from the chair-based exercises is actually greater than in the standing in some circumstances. So let your hands drop down, and now embrace tiger, return to mountain. One more time. And rest. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. So hopefully that was interesting for you.
Yes, it was.